The year 1912. The SS Valencia A passenger steamship, heading to San Francisco, vanished off the stormy coast of Vancouver Island. Over 100 people, including passengers and crew, drowned in one of the most haunting shipwrecks of the time. But what came after wasn't just a tragic sinking. It was something much darker and far more unsettling. Soon after the wreck, people began reporting ghostly sightings. Fishermen and sailors claimed they saw the sunken ship appear on dark, moonless nights, with its dead crew still on board, forever sailing through the misty waters of the Pacific Northwest. The story grew, haunting the shores of Vancouver Island for years, until it became more than just a campfire tale. Today, more than 100 years later, the S. Valencia still lingers in the minds of those daring or reckless. Enough to search for her, but for some, the line between myth and reality is much thinner than they expected. In 2024, a group of friends, led by a young woman named Emma, set out on an adventure to explore the legend of the S. Valencia. The ship had sunk off the coast of Vancouver Island over a century ago, but its ghostly presence was still said to haunt the waters near Patchina Bay. The group decided to camp on the cliffs, not far from where the shipwreck had supposedly occurred. The air was thick with fog as the sun set, making the rocks below look eerie and dangerous. It was the perfect setting for a ghost story. The first night passed quietly, but on the second night, something strange happened. Emma woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of distant singing. It was the voice of a woman, soft and full of sorrow. Curious and a little frightened, Emma left her tent. The cold ocean breeze hit her face as she walked toward the sound. The singing grew louder. The voice seemed to be calling her name, pulling her toward the edge of the cliff. Emma's heart raced as she stood there, looking down at the dark, churning water below. That's when she saw it. Through the thick fog, an old, broken ship appeared. It drifted silently, its sails torn, the wood rotten and falling apart. On the deck, shadowy figures stood, their glowing eyes staring straight at her. Their expressions were twisted with sorrow and rage. Suddenly, the woman's voice turned into a loud, terrifying scream. One of the figures pointed directly at Emma. She froze, too scared to move. The fog began to rise from the water, creeping up the cliff toward her as if it were alive and hunting her. Panicked, Emma ran back to the campsite, hoping to wake her friends. But when she arrived, they were gone. Their tents were still there, flapping in the wind, but the people inside had disappeared without a trace. The voices of the ghosts surrounded her now, louder and angrier. Emma tried to escape, but the fog thickened, making it hard to see or breathe. It felt like something heavy was holding her down. She stumbled, falling hard onto the wet ground. When she looked up, the ship was right in front of her. The ghostly figures were no longer far away. They stood over her, their faces pale and their mouths open in silent screams. One of them stepped forward. Its clothes were torn, and its face looked like it had been underwater for years. Water dripped from its fingers as it reached out to her. "Join us," the ghost whispered, its voice like the crashing waves. Emma blacked out before she could scream. The next morning, searchers found her lying at the edge of the cliff, alone. Her friends were never found. Emma couldn't speak about what had happened that night, but one thing was certain. The S. Valencia was no longer just a legend. The ghost ship was real. Year 1947. A distress call was picked up by ships near the Straits of Malacca, a busy shipping lane between Malaysia and Indonesia. The message came from a Dutch freighter, the S. Arang Medan. The chilling words that followed have become one of the most mysterious and terrifying maritime events in history. All officers, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. There was silence. Then came one final message: I die. Nearby vessels rushed to the location given by the distress call, but when they arrived, what they found was worse than anyone could have imagined. The Scare0 Medan was adrift, eerily still. As the rescue crew boarded the ship, they were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The entire crew lay dead, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror, eyes wide open, mouths agape, their arms stretched out as if they had been trying to fight off something unimaginable. Even the ship's dog was found dead, its body twisted in fear. The strange part, there were no signs of physical injury on any of the bodies. No blood, no wounds, no struggle. It was as if death had come suddenly and without warning. The air around the ship felt heavy and cold. Despite the tropical heat outside, the temperatures seemed to drop as they moved deeper into the ship. When the crew reached the boiler room, they noticed something even more disturbing. It was freezing cold. The machinery, which should have been burning hot, felt icy to the touch. It was as if the ship had crossed into a different, unnatural world. No one could explain what had happened. Theories ranged from toxic gas leaks to paranormal activity, but there was no clear evidence of either. The rescue crew decided to tow the Scare0 Medan to shore for further investigation. But before they could do so, something terrifying happened. Without warning, smoke began pouring out from the ship's lower decks. Moments later, a massive explosion tore through the freighter, sending it into the depths of the ocean, taking with it any chance of discovering the truth. To this day, the mystery of the Scare0 Medan remains unsolved. Was it a freak accident or something far more sinister? Whatever killed the crew of the Scare0 Medan left, no trace, only terror etched into their faces, and a final haunting message that echoes through history: I die. I've been a sailor all my life, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on my last journey aboard the aging freighter, Sea Raven. We were a small crew of 5, experienced men, sailing through a remote part of the Atlantic Ocean. We'd heard stories about the Bermuda Triangle, where ships and planes supposedly disappeared, but none of us believed them until the night it all began. On the third night, the sea was calm, and the moon shone brightly, reflecting off the water like glass. I was in the radio room, doing my usual check-ins. Suddenly, the radio crackled with static, and then a voice broke through. It wasn't from any nearby ship or port. It was faint, but I could tell it was someone in trouble. "Help, please," the voice said. I adjusted the radio and called out, "This is the Sea Raven." There was silence, and then the voice came back, a little clearer. "Help us. We're sinking." But they didn't give any location or say which ship they were on. We tried calling them back, but all we heard was static. Some of the crew joked it was just a malfunction, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, a thick fog rolled in, so dense we couldn't see the horizon. That's when we spotted a ship, drifting in the distance. As we got closer, we realized it was an old freighter, rusted and covered in algae like it had been lost at sea for years. The name on the stern barely read the siren's call. The captain checked the ship's records and said, "This ship's been missing since 1968. No one ever found a single clue about what happened to it." Despite our gut feelings, we decided to board the abandoned ship. As we explored, the silence was eerie, and the smell of decay filled the air. Everything was in disarray, but there were no bodies. Just an empty ship left to rot. In the captain's cabin, I found a waterlogged journal. The final entry read, "We can't escape. The fog brings them. They're watching us, waiting. No one will leave this ship alive." That night, back on the Sea Raven, the fog thickened even more, and strange things started happening. We heard distant voices calling out, footsteps in the empty hallways. Liam, one of the crew members, said he saw someone standing at the bow, but when he got closer, there was nothing there. More reports came in. Shadowy figures, doors slamming on their own, and objects moving around the ship. The crew started losing their minds. One by one, they disappeared. Jack, the engineer, went to check the engine room and never returned. All we found was a trail of water leading up to the deck and over the side. Liam was next. He said he heard his dead brother's voice calling him, and then he walked into the fog. I never saw him again. Now, I was the only one left. The last night was the worst. The fog was so thick I could barely see anything. The shit groaned like it was under some invisible pressure, and I knew something terrible was coming for me. I locked myself in the captain's cabin with the old journal, and that's when I heard them, the spirits of the sirens call. They were outside the door, whispering and scraping. The door slowly creaked open, and there they were. The ghostly crew of the lost ship. Their eyes were hollow, their faces pale. They reached for me, their cold hands pulling me toward the deck. The last thing I saw before the fog took me was the siren's call drifting just beyond the mist. I woke up on the deck, alone. The fog was gone, and my crew was completely missing. The Sea Raven drifted in an empty sea, and there was no sign of the siren's call. I went to the radio, hoping for help, but all I heard was static. Then faintly, I heard that same voice that had called for help on the first night. Only this time, I realized it wasn't coming from another ship. It was coming from me.